something else that's a bit different today too. We've actually got on Twitter a hashtag. So if you're multitask, so I can't multitask. Fortunately, I've got Chantal here with me who can. So she's going to be managing our hashtag on Twitter, and the hashtag is MWEVAL, E-V-A-L. So if you're into that thing, you can join the back channel and have a chat. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about evaluating mentoring programs, and I know that most of you are subscribers to the Mentoring Works newsletter, but there are some people I haven't met personally, so can I just let you know that my company has been operating for 23 years and that we help organisations to set up mentoring programs, train mentors and people who are mentored, and we have a comprehensive range of resources that build and maintain mentoring relationships. We operate just north of Sydney, Australia, and I've run workshops most states here as well as Singapore and North America. Mentoring Works materials support people and programs throughout the world, and today we are focusing on making sure that mentoring works. I hope that you will be able to make the most of our time together, and in fact, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the webinar process, but here are some things that you might want to do. First of all, I do recommend that you take plenty of notes for yourself. I'm hoping that you'll enjoy having a rich content from this webinar. There is a handout. Perhaps you downloaded that handout so that you can write your notes on that as we go through. If you didn't, maybe pen and paper will do, and you can download the handout afterwards and refer back to the notes there then. The other thing that I want to make you aware of is that the webinar is being recorded so that you can watch it and listen to it again later on. It will be available only to Mentoring Works, Mentoring Network members or to people who pay to register for this webinar. So the other thing that you can do to get the most out of this webinar is to ask questions, and there are a couple of ways that you can do that. You will see that there's a little hand icon on your control panel. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment at any time, you can raise your hand. I will pause at various points during the presentation and respond to your questions or your comments. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can do that. If you have got a microphone, I'm going to actually unmute your microphone so that you can speak. If you haven't got a microphone, you can type in your question or your comment, and I will read it out so everyone can hear it, and then I'll respond to it. Now, when you're typing in questions, I usually acknowledge the person who's asked that question or made that comment. If you would prefer to remain anonymous, you can do that simply at the beginning of the question before I start reading it. Just put at the beginning, anonymous please, and then I'll respect your privacy and simply say that, you know, someone's asked this question or made that comment, so that we'll handle it that way. I did mention before, helping me in my office is my assistant Chantal, and Chantal's recording the webinar and put it up on the website later on for you to view and listen to. Now, as I mentioned, the recorded webinar may be accessed by other people, so do be aware that you're being recorded and mindful that others will hear what you say if you are speaking using your microphone. At the moment, everyone who's online is muted to cut out any background noise, but several times during the webinar I will call on people who've got their hand up and switch on the microphone so that they can ask a question or make that comment. But do rest assured, I won't call on you unless you've got your hand out, so you can relax and just sit back and listen if you want to. But of course, it makes my job easier and makes it more interesting for everyone if there is plenty of interaction, so I do encourage you to do that. Okay, what we're talking about today is evaluating your mentoring program, and what I'm going to cover is, first of all, the reasons you might want to evaluate your mentoring, what you can actually evaluate, and then some evaluation methods. Now, according to research consultant Chris Milne, evaluation is assessment of the value or worth of something based on systematic evidence. But I do want to say from the outset that you can't measure everything, And some of the benefits of mentoring are really quite subtle or even intangible. And some of them might be very long-term and remain unknown because they're even below the surface in the unconscious. So do keep that in mind. Nevertheless, having said that, what I am going to cover today is what return on investment you can reasonably expect from a mentoring program. Maybe explore whether you can put hard measures on soft values and what and how you actually can evaluate. But first, let's find out a bit more about where you're at right now in terms of evaluating your mentoring programs. I know many of you on the line have, in fact, had mentoring programs in the past, and I'm curious, have you identified success indicators and ways to measure them? Have you a program of monitoring and participant follow-up during the program? Did you have or do you have plans for participant get-togethers for program review at the midpoint or at the end? Do you have some sort of program evaluation questionnaire? And do you have post-program or other forms of evaluation? Now, to explore those questions and maybe get some feedback, I'm going to put up a poll. Now, you'll see some of the options coming up on your screen now as I launch this poll. And you can tick as many of the following as are applicable for you. So you can choose one or you can tick as many as apply for you. So I can see the votes just starting to come in now. Just click on the option or options. More than one is quite okay. Seeing those votes coming in. Okay, I'll just give you a couple more seconds. Yes, they're coming in now. Almost everyone. We've got 67% of people have voted. I know a couple of people are on the phone, so you're not going to be able to vote in the poll. So I'm going to close this poll now and we'll get the results up on screen. Okay, so some interesting results here. We've got 50% identified success indicators and ways to measure them. So that's a really good start. 100% of respondents are actually doing some sort of monitoring and follow-up during the program, so that's really good. And everyone also said they had a participant review at the midpoint and or the end. And 50% said an evaluation questionnaire at the end. So we've got a split there. Now I can open the lines now and also encourage you to type in if you had some other forms of evaluation. It'd be really interesting to hear from some of you, either by typing in or if you put your hand up, I'll open your mic if you wish to speak, to let me know if you had other methods or some specific methods of evaluation that you can actually share with us. So I'm looking for some hands to go up, some comments to come in. Okay, maybe not. Okay, so we might, I'll open the lines up again a little bit later on for your comments on what you are in fact doing regarding your evaluation at this time if you wish to share that. Right now I'm just going to go on and start to talk about why you want to evaluate mentoring. I believe that whether you use sophisticated metrics or simply ask participants, it really is important to gain feedback on mentoring to evaluate whether the relationships actually worked, to find out whether mentoring made a real difference for people and indeed whether it contributed worthwhile organisational outcomes. Usually you'll need to identify measurable outcomes that will indicate a return on investment, but occasionally an organisation is more concerned with really living its espoused values, and ROI might just be a bonus. Nevertheless, you want to know whether the program is achieving its purpose. You'll see if you printed out the handout the results of a survey that I did a couple of years ago of program coordinators, and the reasons why they evaluated their mentoring programs could be characterised as follows. Some of them evaluated because it was just expected, so it's a symbolic evaluation, just the normal done thing. And I guess we can all sympathise with that. Again, political. Some reasons they evaluated were political because you have to, you're compelled to, for whatever reason, by the higher-ups. Other reasons why, it's pragmatic. Obviously, your mentoring program has to be funded from somewhere, and you'll have to give some feedback so that you can actually secure ongoing funding. And then the final reason I found from my survey was some people actually did use it as a management tool to improve the outcomes of future mentoring programs. So I wonder if you'd take a moment now to write in your own words the answer to question 1 on your handout, or at least the question on page 2 of your handout, down the bottom of page 2, where you've got all the reasons there spelled out in a bit more detail. Why do you want to evaluate mentoring? And I'll give you a few seconds of silence to write. And when you've had a chance to jot something down, I'd love you to put your hand up if you are willing to share your own reasons for wanting to evaluate your mentoring program. So 30 seconds of silence from me while you write why do you want to evaluate your mentoring, and then put your hand up and I'll take some responses. Okay, Cheryl, your hand did go up, so I'm going to unmute you and invite you to comment about why you want to evaluate your program. Cheryl.
No, and actually I just want to know where I find the handout.
Oh, the handout was on the invitation, and also when you connected to the webinar it should have been there for you to download.
And also, if you look in the chat pane, I've actually put a link there as well.
Okay, can you see the chat pane, Cheryl, on your control panel?
Is that underneath where the hand is and everything?
Yes, that panel on your screen. If you scroll down, you may have to click the little triangle to open it up, and there should be a link there for you.
I can email it.
No, I can't see it.
Okay, Chantal's going to email you the handout, so that'll come to you in just a minute. Okay, now Mark says, okay, Mark is saying to justify continuing the program. Obviously, most organisations are looking for that return on investment. They are looking for some success from their programs that will justify continuing the program. Okay, any other questions, comments, any other sharing? Okay, going to move on. And okay, so we are looking at the strategic value and the personal benefit that comes out of mentoring, because mentoring does aim to deliver strategic value for the organisation as well as personal benefits for the individuals. And in my opinion, you evaluate to ensure that your mentoring strategy achieves these outcomes. You can't do this unless you've clarified the strategic purpose of mentoring. In other words, why is mentoring important? Without clear and meaningful goals, you may find it hard to gain support for mentoring, difficult to promote the value of mentoring, and challenge to make it a priority for people. So first, you need to uncover the needs, the wants and the issues that mentoring will address from the perspective of the organisation and the people that you want involved. So let's look at what the organisation actually needs. Most often, mentoring is used by organisations striving for employee engagement, that is to attract, retain and develop people for increased productivity. Or it might be for knowledge management, to prevent the loss of both tacit and implicit information when people leave or move on. Another reason is for skills development, for improved capability or culture change to influence behaviours based on values, assumptions and common practice for your organisation. So again, I'd like to give you a chance to write down on your handout or perhaps on a piece of paper. I'd like you to just jot down for yourself, what do you reckon the strategic aim of your mentoring program actually is? Is it one of those four or is it something else? And in fact, I'm going to launch another poll so that we can get some feedback on this from each of you. So here's the poll coming up, and I'd love you to select one or more of the following. Is your mentoring program aimed at employee engagement? So that is attracting and retaining staff. Is it aimed at skills development, building capability both on the individual and the organisational level? Is it about knowledge management, or is it about culture change, or is there some other reason? So if you would vote, I'm seeing those votes coming in now. 40% have voted. You can choose one or more of these options. And just click on one or more options if you would. Just going to give it a few more seconds while people actually vote on this. If you've got another reason, here we go, another reason other than those shown. Okay, we've got most of those votes in now. I'm about to close the poll. Okay, closing the poll and share the results. Okay. So this is interesting. I'm not sure how many of you clicked more than one option on these, but we do have about a quarter of you are aiming at employee engagement, so attracting and retaining your staff. Another quarter, again, looking at skill development, so building the capability at the individual and the organisational level. And 50% are looking at culture change. So that's very interesting. I'd love to actually hear a little bit more about what sort of culture change you're looking at. So, Francis, I think you're telling me that it actually only allowed for one answer. I thought that we had that set up for more than one. Okay, so maybe if you can type in or put your hand up to tell me something more about the strategic aims of your mentoring programs, that would be really interesting for everyone to share that. You can remain anonymous if you simply, as you're typing in, say anonymous please at the beginning, and then I can share the information without sharing the name if you prefer that. So anyone want to comment on the purpose of your mentoring program? Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands or comments, so we're going to close that poll and keep going. Okay, so the other thing that you really want to look at is what will people achieve? Once you've identified what you want from the program in terms of the strategic viewpoint, you still need to consider the people who are going to be mentored and what you hope they will achieve through mentoring. And maybe there are some tangible results that you could measure. Remember that there are many ways to achieve any particular strategic aim, and this slide shows some examples. These are examples from actual mentoring programs that have been run in my client organisations, and you can see a number of different aims there. Some of them were aimed at actually reducing staff turnover and provided support for new employees. Others targeted a different group of employees and provided career development for those people. Another organisation, their strategic objective was to become an employer of choice, and therefore they focused on career planning as well as skill development for their program. Another organisation that was looking at knowledge management looked at personal development planning as well as improving communication across the organisation. We've got succession planning, where they got very experienced people to share tacit information. So some of that information that is within the knowledge, perhaps under the level of consciousness, or not made explicit. And I've had a number of mentoring programs that were aimed strategically at diversity and equity, and they developed targeted staff, so specific groups of staff, and also aimed at building relationship across different particular groups. Okay, I'm getting some comments and questions coming in. Okay, so Francis is saying develop a culture where women are seen as equal participants. Yeah, and there have been quite a number of programs over the last few years that have been specifically aimed at women and looking at equity. A number of government departments, I feel, have led the way in those types of area, being concerned with equity issue. And Mark has a comment to remove some of the barriers between divisions. Yeah, you know, we've still got that hangover of a lot of the silo mentality as organisations became bigger, and particularly in organisations where you've got specialist areas, perhaps specialist professions or particular groups. A lot of the government departments where you've been amalgamated, but you've got what were previously separate departments drawn into one organisation, or you've got particular professional specialists, they can become quite you know, individual, and you actually want to build relationships between people and have much more communication across the organisation. So that's a very common reason for having mentoring programs, because you will link people from different parts of the organisation in your program, and that has some very worthwhile outcomes. Okay, so the bottom line really is that that you need to look at the objectives of your program and make sure they're realistic. So you want to look at both, as I mentioned, the strategic outcomes that you're looking for, as well as what you want the people to achieve as a result of participating. So you need to ask yourself, well, what might indicate success? What is, if your program was successful, what would tell you that it was successful? What would you be able to see or touch or feel in some way? What could you actually measure? Are there tangible things, tangible outcomes that you could point to? Are there any other ways that you would know that your program had achieved success? Now, I believe that setting objectives at the beginning of your mentoring program is really the foundation for success. You put a solid foundation down and you can build on it. And whether you've got to look for hard measures, return on investment, dollar value that can be measured, or whether it's simply success indicators that you can at least point to and say, this tells us that the program actually worked. You need something, and then you can start designing your mentoring program, which is why I like to talk about evaluation at the beginning of planning your mentoring program, not just at the end, not halfway through, but really at the beginning, because as I said, I believe it really is the foundation. So let's look at some of the things that can be quantified, and I've got some from various programs coming up on the next slide, and maybe you can add to these with your own list. So do think about anything that you have measured or you could measure, and I'll open the lines up again or get you to type in very shortly. Staff retention is an obvious one, and you can do before and after measures of staff retention that will give you a solid number to point to. You can also look at something like, and there have been programs where the return to work after maternity leave was measured, or the return to work after an injury, for example, or long service leave, or any other reason that people temporarily leave the workplace. So you can do before and after measures and use mentoring as a strategy to increase the return. You could look at representation of your target group in various grades, roles, positions and locations. So Francis, in terms of your question before, your comment before about equity for women, this would be an obvious one where you would look at the current levels of women in particular grades, roles, positions and locations. You'd measure before and then you'd do a measure sometime after the mentoring program and see what had changed. You could also look at percentage of applications for internal jobs or promotions from your target group. You could look at the number of those people who actually obtained a position or a promotion. And you could also look at the number participating in training programs and development opportunities, acting up, that sort of thing. You could, if you're looking at attracting particular groups to your organisation, you could look at the number of external applications for jobs. You could also look at some benchmarking comparisons if you've got figures from similar types of organisations or similar industries. And again, you can do before and after measures on each of these. And some of these are quite easy to put a dollar value on. For example, retention. A lot of my clients have mentoring programs specifically designed to attract and retain graduates. And you know, a lot of people spend a lot of money in recruiting graduates, and there's actually no return on that investment if you lose a new person within 2 years. And you're probably aware Gen Y has been notoriously career-oriented and very mobile. Some organisations, such as government agencies, can't pay big dollars to get them or keep them. So mentoring is a cost-effective strategy. Likewise, many organisations are not ready for the exodus of experience when all us baby boomers retire. But being mentors can help keep them. It can help engage them and increase their productivity while facilitating that knowledge transfer that you're after. You can probably find some figures within your own organisation or industry regarding the replacement cost of staff. Obviously it varies depending on the role, but a ballpark estimate of around 2 to 3 times annual salary per person is a starting point, and you can't ignore that kind of money. That's why one of our major banks was a trailblazer 20 years ago with mentoring as part of a suite of programs for women on maternity leave. They realised the cost of losing talent and that experience long term was not only unacceptable, it was also avoidable. So they introduced a mentoring program to assist women to stay in contact with what was going on at the bank and to manage the transition back into the workplace with a young infant. So one way of evaluating the return on investment is to look at the cost of not having a mentoring program. One client last year had a career-focused mentoring program, and because of the global financial situation, it also coincided with a job freeze in that same organisation. Yet participants spent 12 months enthusiastic about their employer and confident about their future instead of succumbing to disenchantment. I wonder what that did for productivity. So what I'd like you to do now is have a look at your handout if you have it, and you'll find on page 4, and if you don't have it, you can simply draw up a 3-column table. Because what I've got in the handout is a 3-column table, and the first column on the left-hand side is headed up Strategic Aims, and in brackets it says Organisational Need. The middle column, the heading is Program Purpose, and this is for the broad aim or focus of your mentoring program. And then on the right-hand column, it's headed up Realistic Objectives or Measurable Outcomes. Now I do have some examples in the handout. I have the same example as a strategic aim. So I've said there that reduced staff turnover was what the organisation was after through its mentoring program. And yet there were 3 different ways of approaching that through mentoring. One was targeting new employees and providing them with support. So in the middle column we've got support new employees as our program focus. A second program was looking at the career progression of a targeted group, and a third program looked at professional development for a particular group. So then we come to the third column of the realistic objectives. So what could be measured? In the first program, they measured a percentage of increased retention in their new employees. The second program, where they were looking at the career progression of a targeted group, they measured the number of internal applications for higher grade positions. And the third program, where they were focused on professional development, they actually identified the number of staff completing a designated course. So what I'd like you to do is try to list for yourself, firstly, what's the strategic aim of your program? Secondly, what's the program purpose? So the broad aim or focus of the program. And then thirdly, can you come up with something you could actually measure? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds of silence once again for you to write, and then I'm looking for some typed in responses or some hands up so I can open your microphones and you can share with others what your strategic aims, program purpose and realistic objectives might be. So take a moment now. I'm giving you 30 seconds of silence to respond. So I'm seeing that Cheryl typed in before, removing barriers to performance is the program purpose of for the mentoring, and that's an interesting one, and be interesting to see how that you'd actually be able to measure that. If this were a live workshop, we'd probably do some brainstorming with a flip chart, and that's what I'd suggest that you actually do. In a webinar, of course, we can only go so far, and I'm hoping that the handout and your notes will help you take this further after the webinar. Anyone else like to make a comment on your strategic purpose? Okay, they're coming in now. So Francis is saying engagement and retention is the aim, and we've already said that retention, yes, you can measure. Engagement, you generally measure engagement by staff surveys, so I'll be interested to know, and if any of you would like to type in, whether you do staff satisfaction surveys in your organisation that give you a feel for engagement, or whether there are in fact any other measures that you use. Okay, and Mark is talking about the graduate program and reduced staff turnover. And the graduates having clear career goals. So at the end of that program, you would probably be asking whether people had clear career goals. Okay. Francis is saying, no, you don't currently have a staff satisfaction survey. Okay, some organisations do and don't. Erin, hello Erin. So Erin is saying the purpose of your program is increasing confidence and competence of our new graduate nurses. Okay, so we're going to look in a moment at how you might measure some of these things. And Cheryl's saying, I think our measurement was in fact change in attitude, less frustration, feeling of contribution. Yeah, I think I remember the survey that we did at the end of your program, and we gained some qualitative input at the final review and then did a questionnaire based on that. So, okay, so let's start to talk then about how you actually measure some of these ideas. So in a mentoring program, what can you evaluate? Well, here's what I suggest. You can evaluate the processes. So the program itself, you can look at the recruitment. So how did people get to be in your mentoring program? What was the process you used to sort of, if you like, advertise or promote your program? Was that effective? Did you get a good response from the people that you wanted to respond to your invitation to be part of the mentoring program? Or indeed, did you select a target group? How did you choose? If you asked for volunteers, for example, did you have some selection criteria that allowed you to select the people who would get the most benefit and the most contribute perhaps the most value from an organisational perspective as well as benefit personally? How did you match people? How successful was the matching? And what about communication about the program, not only to the people involved, especially the people involved, but not only to them, to others as well? I think you also want to evaluate particularly the mentoring relationships. So what was the quality of those, and how many or what percentage were maintained for the entire duration of your mentoring program? Another good measure in terms of the success of your mentoring was, did relationships continue after the formal program? I find a lot of people where the relationship has been really good want to continue informally after the mentoring program has officially concluded. You also want to look at participant support. How good was the training? What about the materials? Did they get what they needed? What about resources? And were there support activities over the life of the program, and were these adequate? Did they meet the needs of your participants and support them really well? And then finally we come back to the outcomes that we've been talking about already. And you want to look at outcomes from the point of view of the mentorees, the people who are mentored. Obviously, what did they get out of the mentoring? But also look at the mentors. I'm finding that mentors significantly benefit from their mentoring relationships. In fact, I'm of the belief that mentors often gain as much, if not more, from mentoring than do people who are mentored, if the mentors are open to that kind of personal development. And of course the organisation, those outcomes from an organisational perspective. There are two types of data that you can actually collect. One is the qualitative data, so the opinions of your participants, and the simplest way to gather that information is to ask them, and there are various ways you can go about collecting that data. The other kind of data that you will need, especially from an organisational perspective, is that quantitative data. So numerical data, something you can put numbers on, and perhaps some sort of statistical analysis. And this is where your before and after comparisons can be really useful. But you do need to plan your evaluation, and you need to, first of all, make sure that you have got documented the attributes of success. And again, can I stress, you need these at the beginning of your mentoring program. It's not so useful to come up with them at the end. You want to go into mentoring with at least an outline, a framework of what you believe will give you an indication of success. You need to work out what information you need and whether you can in fact access that information. Look at the data sources. Where are you going to get that information from, and how reliable will it be? You want to look at your strategies, or in fact what will you do and what's involved and who will do it in terms of gathering that information. And here's a curly one. I want you to consider extraneous factors. I have found, and you've probably been thinking as I've been going through some of the things that you can measure before, even though you can measure them before and after, they're not only going to be influenced by the mentoring program. There are lots of external factors that could impact on those, for example, retention. For example, whether or not people maintain their mentoring relationship over the life of the program. A program that ended recently lost 2 partnerships, not because of any other factor except that 2 participants went on maternity leave and felt they were unable to continue the mentoring relationship. Now, that brings up another issue, because had we known that they were going on maternity leave, or had they talked about it before they in fact went, we could have examined whether the relationship might have continued in another form, or whether there could have been a replacement. In one case it was the mentor who went on maternity leave. Could we have found a replacement mentor and brought them in? And so you have to be aware of all of the other things. I reckon the old saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, applies in terms of evaluation, because it can be a two-edged sword. And I will admit to you now, there was a program last year where some of the measures we identified at the beginning and expected to go up actually went down at the end, when we measured them at the end. So what I had to look at there was really, it was speculation, I would say, about the reasons why participation in training and conference attendance actually, and networking, went down. In hindsight, I reckon what happened was people were so engaged with the mentoring program that it took priority over other events. But at the front end, when we were setting up those criteria, we didn't imagine that that would be the case. We expected that those would increase. So you can benefit from my mistake on that one and be aware of that. The other thing that you want to look at in planning your evaluation is actually the reporting. What sort of report will be required at the end, and by whom? Is it just a simple collation of the data that you can hand over, or are you looking for commentary? Are you looking for conclusions? Are you looking for recommendations? Or indeed, are you looking for some statistical analysis? And again, I'll share one of my errors with you that was very costly for me. I got caught out when I didn't clearly define what one client wanted a couple of years ago, and I delivered what they wanted, obviously, in the end, but it took me about 10 times as long as what I had budgeted for, and so the return for me was a loss, you know, but it pays to be clear. The other thing that I'll mention to you is that in terms of reporting, I think that far too often we collect data from participants and don't feed it back to them. So people get soon disillusioned with constantly being asked to fill in questionnaires or their opinions being sought, and they never know what happens to that information. So I do encourage you to make sure that at least in some form, whether it's a summary or something that goes back to the people who are good enough to give their time and their opinions, to let them know what the results actually were. So in terms of evaluation methods, here are a few. The before and after measures that I mentioned before, collecting the data before and after, just being aware of those extraneous factors and outside influence that might give you a false positive or a false negative in that case. Reaction surveys that I've mentioned. Now, some people are quite unkind and call these smiley sheets, the sort of thing you hand out at the end of a workshop. But I have found that where you can get people to make considered responses to them, where you can get more than just a tick the box kind of answer and invite their comments, you'll certainly find out if people hated it or loved it, or somewhere in between. People do make comments that can be quite useful to you. You may be able to get people to complete some sort of learning journal, not to be collected by you, but encouraging them to take some notes over the life of their mentoring relationship, if they have a worksheet, if they have a template, a handout, or a book like the Mentoring Journal, where they actually record the goals and the outcomes of their mentoring. You don't necessarily see that, but you can encourage them to go back to that as they're reflecting on the outcomes of the mentoring program, so that they've actually got some good data to share with you. I would encourage you to consider a monthly informal review, and that's best done by your program coordinators, ringing, getting face-to-face, or talking, even if it's just in the corridors or over coffee, about how it's going with at least some of your participants, preferably with all of them. I know a lot of program coordinators regularly email out to all their participants and invite comments. but people are so busy these days, I'm sure that like me, you're guilty of not responding to every email that you get. But picking up the phone or getting face-to-face with a person will get you a better finger on the pulse of what's happening. You can do individual interviews, so you can actually set up something a bit more structured and ask people the same questions so that you've got some more structured feedback. You could do focus groups or workshops, and a lot of my clients, as you know, do a midpoint review, so halfway through the mentoring program they'll gather people together face-to-face, or you can do that by webinar now. Or in a workshop situation to find out what's working well, what could perhaps be improved. You can do a survey questionnaire at the end of a mentoring program. Of course, there are challenges with that. Getting them distributed is easy. Getting them back in usually means a lot of chasing. What I'm tending to do these days is where I run a final workshop for a client, I'll usually get participants to fill in the questionnaire on the spot and collect them up. At least you know you've got them, and people can put in some other qualitative data later if they wish to. So, how do you know mentoring works? Well, you must have your success indicators. I also recommend an early follow-up. Excuse me. I actually suggest that when you start a mentoring program, very quickly after you've matched up people and got them started in the mentoring program, do a quick follow-up with them within the first month. Make sure that the pairs have met and that they have started to build their relationship, maybe made some progress. So do that quick follow-up, because the longer it goes, if it's not got started, the harder it is to get it started. I also recommend that you do monitor regularly, probably on a monthly basis. If possible, do a midpoint review. If possible, do some sort of finale, and if possible, do some post-program measures. Now, of course, you need to do some measures at the conclusion of the program, but you'd be aware that some of the results are going to be longer term. For example, even retention, you're not going to get a good results indicator immediately. You might have to measure again in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, even 3 years, and track those participants and see if there's a difference between them. And if you've got a another sample group, you can look at the comparison results with those as well. So I'm going to pause for 30 seconds, take a breath, take a sip of my water here, and invite any questions or comments that you have at this time. So you can type in your questions, or you can put your hand up if you've got a microphone. We'll be able to open up the microphone for you to speak. So questions or comments on anything that we've covered so far. I'll just give you 30 seconds to think about that. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands or any questions at the moment. If you're typing, keep typing. I'll give you another chance in a moment. I know it takes me a couple of seconds to frame my question when I'm attending a webinar. Okay, just while you're thinking about the questions, and before we go into the final wrap-up stage of this webinar, and by the way, for those of you who are members of the Mentoring Network, there is a forum so we can continue our questions and answers and discussion on the Mentoring Network online forum. Okay, Francis. Okay, more on post-program measures. Okay, so some of the things I talked about earlier that you could actually measure, for example, looking at the number of people who apply for positions. So in your case, Francis, where you're looking at equity for women, you'd probably have a before measure, and you could go before, immediately before the mentoring, 6 months, 12 months before, whatever data that you've actually got. How many women actually applied for some specific positions, or how many applied for a particular course, how many completed a particular course. And then after the program, you could gather at the conclusion, probably one of the questions you'd ask participants, how many of you have applied over the course, and perhaps there was an opportunity where people were able to apply. how many have considered a tertiary course or a short course or some sort of internal or external training or development opportunity. You don't only want to measure those at the immediate conclusion, you also want to look down the track. So keep a track of your target group. Maybe ask them again 6 months and 12 months and 2 years after the program. Have you applied? So you get a set of questions that you ask again at various intervals. And so that would give you some post-program measures, because I believe that although you do get an immediate return in terms, or an immediate result in terms of your mentoring, a lot of the results, there might be a time lag between the actual program, and you want to capture those because they're important. I mean, sometimes job opportunities don't come up in a lot of government departments in particular, and in other areas as well these days. At the moment, there aren't necessarily the level of job opportunities, so people can't apply for that many jobs. But in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, that may well change. The client that I worked with last year that had the job freeze, that job freeze isn't going to last forever, and they need to do a measure of those and look at those particular people as compared to the general population once that job freeze ceases. So I'll be recommending to them in 12 months' time, even in 2 years' time, when the job freeze is over, you look at the group who went through mentoring as compared to people who didn't have mentoring, and see if there's a significant difference between those that apply for jobs and indeed those that get the jobs between the two groups. And that would give you a really good hard measure if you've got a large enough sample population. I'm not a statistician, I can't even say it, and numbers are not my strong suit, but I'm sure that in an organisation like yours you have people who could actually do that kind of number crunching. Thanks for that question, Francis. Any other questions, comments? Okay, keep typing if you wish to. I just want to share with you our webinar calendar just before we go into the final stages of our webinar. We've got about 8 minutes left. Just want to let you know that that we have got more webinars coming up in 2010. Some of them are free for everybody, others are free only for members of the Mentoring Network online. So our next webinar is one that's a complimentary webinar called 7 Steps to a Successful Mentoring Program. That's on the 12th of April. A little bit different from this particular webinar. It'll be a little bit shorter. It'll be based on questions and answers. So I will be basically giving just a little bit of content, and the rest of the time I'll be responding to the questions that people send in. In May, we have got a webinar that is complimentary only to our Mentoring Network online members. Other people have to pay for this one, and this will actually be a 2-part webinar, and it'll be based on a session that I'm presenting at the Australian Institute of Training and Development in April called Mentoring, Brain-Based Benefits for Mentors. And it's 2 parts because I'll be giving part 1 and then asking you to go away and experiment with the ideas that I present in part 1, and then part 2 will come back and debrief the experiment and talk about what actually happened. So you can see on your screen, and you can actually download this calendar that tells you when the webinars are, and so that you can set that time aside in your calendar. Of course, if you are a member of the Mentoring Network online, you get all of our webinars as a complimentary part of your package. If you're not currently a member, I urge you to actually look at joining, because what you get as part of your membership with the Mentoring Network Online is all of my books in the form of ebooks. You get all of the mentoring tips and Mentoring Works articles. You get webinars, you get podcasts, so with audio recordings. You get slide casts, online learning modules, and videos. You also get discussion forums, and question and answers opportunities. So in fact, everything you need to create and maintain your mentoring program is within the Mentoring Network Online, which is a password protected area on our website. And you'll also find a library. So you can see there very briefly all of the things that are currently in the library, and of course we are adding to that library all the time. How it works: you get access to the resources that other people have to pay for, you get answers from your peers, your colleagues, as well as myself, you can connect and interact with a mentoring community, and you do get members only exclusive benefits. If you're not a member, I urge you to join. There's great value there. My corporate clients do get complimentary membership. Otherwise, annual membership is 600 Australian dollars for the year, or you can pay it by the month at 55 Australian dollars per month. Now, just coming back to our summary of what we've covered in this workshop. Now, I'm just seeing a question or a comment from Mark. Okay, would a formal mentoring program of 12 months duration be too short? The duration of that of 12 months for a program is not too short. Indeed, a number of mentoring programs, their duration is only 6 months, Mark. Personally, I prefer a 12 months duration. A lot of programs have about an 8-month duration. They might kick off, say, in February and end in December, which is, 7-8 months, which is okay. I prefer the 12-month model. What you've got to take into consideration, even in 12 months, most people will have annual leave of, say, 4 weeks. So if you've got a mentor and a mentoree, potentially you've got 8 weeks where they won't be mentoring. Apart from their holidays, they may not coincide with the like school holidays and summer holidays that tend to slow people down. So in a 12-month program, what you need to do is make sure you've got some activities to rev people up at various points over the 12 months. So if you had a program, say you were starting a program as many to do in early July, 12-month program, you need to have some events in February, March to re-engage and re-energise people. Typically a midpoint review would be something you'd do, say, in February if you'd started in July. Even though it's not really halfway through, it is a time when people need to be rejuvenated into the home stretch at the 12 months. So no, I don't think formal mentoring program of 12 months is too short. I am a little concerned about 6 months, though many programs are 6 months. You've got to be short, sharp and hard-hitting in 6 months. Some are roughly 7 or 8 months, and some go longer than that. But you do need to be aware, if you go longer, you've got to look after your mentors. You don't want to burn them out, so do be aware of that. Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left now. I'm hoping that what we've covered for you, and certainly the 3 key questions on your handout, I would suggest that you go back to your handout after this webinar and see if you can flesh out your own answers to these questions. What return on investment can you reasonably expect from mentoring? And I'll look forward to some feedback from you in the forum or later on about what return on investment you're actually looking for. Can you put hard measures on soft values? I think that you do that by your questionnaires, where you take the qualitative data, frame it up into a question, and then put a rating scale on that, and that at least allows you to put some numbers on your softer feedback. What and how can you evaluate? Well, hopefully you've got some ideas from what we've covered today. I wanted to finish up by reminding you that you can't actually measure everything. And at the risk of mixing my metaphors, I said at the beginning, it's a bit like the tip of the iceberg. You know, there's a lot under the surface that you can't measure. But what I also like to think about when I think about mentoring is, you know, those bulbs that produce these beautiful flowers. And I don't know if you know, but if you're a bit of a gardener, you may know that when you take a bulb, you get a bulb, you can actually store that in a cool, dry place until you're ready to plant it. And sometimes it can be years until you put that bulb in the right conditions and you nurture it, and all of a sudden the nourishment that's contained in that bulb actually can start to shoot and produce lovely flowers. So mentoring is something that the results aren't always evident immediately, and yet they can lie dormant and come forth when they're actually in the right conditions. I hope that you have found a great deal of food for thought. I hope I've given you some answers, but I hope I've also stirred up more questions and answers, and happy to talk through some of those with you in the forum later on. Please, before you go, we're right on time now, but do take a moment to write down what did you gain from the webinar and how are you going to use that. You know, this is the way that we actually make sure that you've invested your time well and got value from it. So do write down for yourself. I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes. If you feel like typing in, that's great. But basically, we're going to wrap this up now. We're 1 minute past 12. Here's a favourite quote of mine: paths are made by walking. So I hope that you will do something very useful with the knowledge that you've gained from this workshop. I'm going to sign off now officially. I will stick around for a few more minutes.